Listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of APA and Chair of the New Urbanism Division, and I'm your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, December 1st, can you believe it? And we're going to be hearing the presentation, Queer in the Conversation, The Ethics of Inclusion. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar, or you can call the 1-800 number that's shown on the screen right now in bold. For your content questions related to the presentation, you can type those in the questions box, also located in the webinar toolbar. And we're going to answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. On your screen is a list of the sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2017. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to their members. If you're looking down the list and you don't see your chapter or division listed, we just ask that you reach out to them and say, hey, you should join the consortium. Today's webcast is sponsored by the LGBTQ division. You can learn more about all of our divisions at planning.org/divisions. Coming up on your screen is a list of our last webcasts of 2017. You can register for these by visiting our webcast webpage at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. To log your CM credits for attending today's webcast, just head over to planning.org, log into your MyAPA account, and then up at the top, under your CM log, you can search for CM activities, either by typing in the event number or the title of today's webcast, both of which are found on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And this webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM ethics credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for distance education, and you can check those out again on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions. And we are recording today's webcast. It will be available on our YouTube channel at the end of the session. And we will also have a PDF of the PowerPoint available up on our webcast webpage at the end of today's session. So with that, I am going to verbally turn it over to Cade Habakkuk, who will get us started.
Great, Thank you. So my name is Cade Habakkuk, and I'm a planner here in New York, and I'm a past chair of the LGBTQ and Planning Division, and I'm very happy that our division is hosting this webinar, and pleased to welcome all our listeners. I want to thank Christine and Ben, both of whom do a tremendous job always making the webinars so easy for the rest of us. They handle all the logistics. So I can't emphasize enough how easy it is and how important it is that everyone think about putting together a webinar. It's just a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity for credits too, and in this case for the ethics credits as well, obviously. But it's also a way for us planners to be working together around the country, not just everyone listening, but people actually working together. So I'm very pleased that we have Bonnie Johnson and Vanessa Delgado, both of whom will be speaking to us from the beautiful University of Kansas, my alma mater, so I'm a bit partial, but it's the webinar itself that's brought us together. So just a great example of how this really does bring value to all the members here. Bonnie and Vanessa will both be introducing themselves and, of course, the session in a moment. But on behalf of the division, I want to just take a moment and explain why this session is so great. First, it's just very well put together. And part of that comes from the fact that Bonnie and Vanessa are not novices to the subject or the work they present. They routinely work with communities to address LGBTQ issues and diversity in general and the idea of inclusivity. And they're also ethics professionals, if I can call them that, which means that they do a great job explaining why ethics matter, not just to be good people, but to be strong professional planners and truly great public servants. So secondly, obviously there's the LGBTQ theme, which is of course important to our division. And Bonnie and Vanessa will be presenting this issue to people listening from all around the country. So I encourage listeners to listen to the LGBTQ discussion as something that's directly relevant to your own work, your own community, and consider that the LGBTQ issues in planning vary according to location and individuals, groups, communities, and whatever matter is at hand. The message you will walk away with is that you need to listen and you need to pay attention, and as good social scientists to be observant, and as public servants to seek to have empathy and understanding of how our work as planners truly affects people's lives. And finally, that idea leads us to the ethical principles that will be discussed here. Not just the nuances or tricky situations that we sometimes think of when we anticipate a discussion of ethics or scenarios, but the fundamentals associated with listening, both with impartiality and objectivity, and also with a sense of empathy and compassion. Engaging your communities so that you're helping them to be the best they can be. Planners that care about the health, safety, and welfare communities are what we're all about here. So I think that may be what most excites me most about this session, is that Bonnie and Vanessa will truly inspire you. So you'll close out of this session with clear understanding of issues and critically with skills that you can put to immediate use, and with contacts you can turn to, Bonnie or Vanessa or the division, anytime issues arise. But I think you're going to be truly inspired. So thank you all for joining us. And with that, I turn it over to Bonnie and Vanessa.
Well, thank you, Cade. This is Bonnie Johnson. I'll introduce myself first, and that way you can know whose voice is who, and then Vanessa will introduce herself. So I'm Bonnie Johnson. I'm a professor of urban planning at the University of Kansas. But before becoming a professor, I was a practicing planner for 8 years. I'm also the Kansas APA chapter professional development officer. And just this year, earlier this year, I had an article co-written with Mary Kay Peck and Steve Preston in the Journal of the American Planning Association, where it's called City Managers Have Ethics Too. And we compare the City Managers Code of Ethics with the AICP Code of Ethics, and how we sometimes dovetail and sometimes have different points of view. So if you want to know more about some different professions and their points of view on ethics, you can check out that article in JAPA. And then let me have Vanessa introduce herself.
Good afternoon, y'all. And for some of you on the West Coast, good morning still, technically, I believe. My name is Vanessa Delgado. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am a campus program coordinator at the University of Kansas on our Edwards campus. I come to this work because I have previously served in the Center for Sexuality and Gender Diversity here at KU. All of my professional experience is with LGBTQIA individuals in higher education. And so this conversation around ethics and how we queer any kind of conversation, whether it's in planning or in just our daily lives, is really important to me. And so when Bonnie and I first had this conversation, it was really exciting, and just thinking about the ways in which we can all be embedding queer work into whatever we do professionally as well as personally, I think is a really fruitful conversation. So I'm happy to be here.
And as we go through our presentation, and this is Bonnie again, I'm going to often play the role of the good-hearted planner who is trying her best. And then Vanessa is going to be the expert who will nudge this good-hearted planner in the direction of being more culturally competent. So we're going to get going here. So that's what we look like. So you can put a face to these voices, and away we will go. Since this is an official AICP ethics session, there are certain things we have to do that the powers that be require. And so we first have to start off with our disclaimer. And this is James Peters here. He's the ethics officer, and he's here to remind us to please note this session has been created to provide general education regarding the AICP Code of Ethics. Though examples, sample problems, and question and answer sessions are an important part of illustrating application of the code's provisions, all certified planners should be aware that only the ethics officer, that's me, James Peters, is authorized to give informal advice on the propriety of a planner's proposal. Say that fast 3 times. Propriety of a planner's proposed conduct. And only the ethics committee can give a formal opinion. If you have a specific question regarding a situation arising in your practice, you're encouraged to seek the opinion of the ethics officer, James Peters. Okay, so what are we going to do? We've got a lot of stuff to do with you guys today. So we're going to start off with a little pop quiz to test your code knowledge, then give a brief overview of the AICP Code of Ethics and why do codes of ethics matter. We're going to hone in on our aspirations in the code, and then Vanessa's going to go over some terminology and some techniques for being more inclusive. We're going to talk about how can you tell you have an inclusive community. And then we have a scenario. All ethics sessions are supposed to have a scenario for you to ponder. What would you do? We will have that. And then we will go over some things that you can do to be more inclusive. And then we'll have questions, some answers perhaps, and some thoughts at the end. So the first thing we're going to do is guess which code is which. How do different professions talk about discrimination? So here we have the anti-discrimination clauses from 4 different professional codes of ethics. One of these is from our own AICP code. One is from the International City County Management Association's code. Another one is from the American Society of Civil Engineers. And the last one up here, one of these is the American Institute of Architects. So I'll go down the list, and this will be a little quiz for yourself, ungraded of course, to see if you can figure out which code is which. So number 1, handle all matters of personnel on the basis of merit so that fairness and impartiality govern a member's decisions pertaining to appointments, pay adjustments, promotions, and discipline. So think about whose that is. Number 2, we shall not unlawfully discriminate against another person. Number 3, members shall not discriminate in their professional activities on the basis of race, religion, gender, national origin, age, disability, or sexual orientation. And then we have number 4, shall in all matters related to their profession treat all persons fairly and encourage equitable participation without regard to gender or gender identity, race, national origin, ethnicity, religion, age, sexual orientation, disability, political affiliation, or family, marital, or economic status. So, whose is whose? Well, number 1, if maybe you had an inkling that that was the city manager's code, you were right. And you kind of have those hints where it's talking about pay and promotions, kind of seems like that is what the city managers would maybe hone in on. If you said that perhaps the AICP code was number 3, you would be incorrect, because that is the American Institute of Architects. Then if you think, well, okay, of the ones that are left, which one is AICP? If you think maybe it's number 4, you would be wrong. That are our colleagues, the civil engineers, have number 4. So what's left? Number 2, we shall not unlawfully discriminate against another person. Now, Vanessa and I did a version of this ethics session at the 2016 Kansas Planning Conference. And we started off with this little quiz, and we had about 40 Kansas planners at our ethics session. And we almost didn't get past this slide for our presentation because the planners in the room were kind of appalled that this was what our codes of ethics said about discrimination.
And from memory, most people thought that it was incorrect, that we were maybe wrong on that, but we looked it up.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of people thought number 3 was the AICP code until the results were revealed. And so that we got a lot of pushback, and people wanted to right then and there say, what can we do? What can we do to change our code? Because we should be held to a higher standard. And I have to say that the context here in Kansas may be a little different from your state, although others of you are in the same boat as we are here in Kansas, where in Kansas, you can lawfully discriminate against someone based on sexual orientation and gender identity or expression. So that unlawfully discriminate is kind of a low bar here in Kansas. And the planners here at our ethics session really thought that we should be held to a higher standard than just what is unlawful. As I've talked with planners around the country about this, a lot do point out that yes, states are different, and that you do have in your city or your organization HR policies that would mean that you, in your job, you couldn't discriminate. But we do come back to, well, should maybe our code of ethics be a little bit stronger so that we're not having to fall back on HR policies or what our city's policies particularly are. So I just wanted to kind of give that context and get into our next topic, which are why do ethics matter, and why talk about discrimination and inclusion. And I think just our discussion right now about what your state law has to say about discrimination is really highlighting why we need to talk about these things. So if you haven't already, you can load up the AICP Code of Ethics and kind of follow along here. So just as the basics of why ethics matter, in all that we do in planning, there's money to be made, maybe perhaps not by the ethical planner, but a lot of what we do involves winners and losers. Also, what we do involves sensitive information. So having codes of ethics to guide us about those things, yeah, that's a good idea. We are dealing often with not only the community's plans, but individuals' plans for their future and people's hopes and dreams. So we have to be cognizant of that, and our code of ethics helps remind us of that. It also reminds us that we are the keepers of the public trusts, and that we have to hold ourselves to high standards because as professional planners, we are trusted to look out for the community and look out for the public interest. We also have to remember that we are a link in the chain of democracy. Whether you're a planner that works for a city, a county, federal agency, or for a consulting firm, we are all part of connecting people with their communities and giving them a voice. And that's part of our role in a democracy, is to give people a voice and to look out for due process, freedom of speech, and fairness. A code of ethics also reminds us that we are in this together. Unfortunately, if one of us does a poor job, that can reflect on all of us. Codes of ethics tell planners and the public what to expect, what it is that we stand for. And codes of ethics are good for elevating the profession, helping us to all reach for our best selves and the best job that we can do. The AICP code ethics code is divided up into sections. a statement of aspirational principles in Section A. Section B are the rules of conduct, and it's in those rules of conduct that no unlawful discrimination is in that part. And it is a good thing in the AICP Code of Ethics sessions to remind people that it is the rules of conduct that can get you into trouble as far as your certification is concerned. Someone can lodge a complaint against you if you violate the rules of conduct. Now, the statement of aspirational principles, there is kind of the expectation that those are a little bit of superhuman aspirations, and that we may not, as humans, all the time reach those aspirations, so that though you can't be brought up on charges as far as that's concerned, but you got to pay attention to those rules of conduct. Then the rest of the code are some procedures, filing a complaint, what to do if you're convicted of a serious crime, things like that. I want to start honing in on these aspirational principles, because that's where we really get into our obligations as far as being inclusive. And so the aspirational principles are then divided up into our responsibilities to the profession, clients, employers, and to the public. So here's the different components of those aspirational principles that have to do with inclusion. And part of those aspirations is that we have a goal of building better, more inclusive communities. That is in our Code of Ethics. We're to serve the public interest with compassion, conscious of the rights of others, opportunity to have a meaningful impact. We're supposed to seek social justice, expand choice and opportunity, promote racial and economic integration, and we're supposed to urge the alteration of policies, institutions, and decisions that oppose such needs. So we have some high aspirations here. I wanted to get into, there was an article in 2011 by Catherine Quick and Martha Feldman where they distinguish between participation and inclusion. And I think it's an interesting point they're making. We in planning often talk about participation, and that means increasing input, whereas inclusion is making connections among people across issues and over time. Now, Quick and Feldman point out that having a diversity of voices and involving all the community in participation and inclusion are important for both, but I like that their description of inclusion is this making connections among people across issues and over time. It's not just a one-time thing that you're doing. You're creating this inclusive atmosphere over time. I also want to see how many of you perhaps remember from planning school. I'm a planning professor, remember, so I'm now going to try to remind you of think back to your days as a master's student. Maybe perhaps you read John Forrester's Planning in the Face of Power. And I thought I'd draw out a quote from John Forrester. Citizens are profoundly affected, therefore, not by what gets produced by public and private organizations, but also by how these organizations reproduce social and political relations of knowledge and ignorance, consent and difference, trust and dependency, and attention and confusion. I think our Code of Ethics, particularly the aspirational part, is reminding us that we need to do this and be aware of the processes and how we are doing things and helping us pay attention to being inclusive. Now, Vanessa is going to help us out with our cultural competency and teach us some terminology.
All right, y'all. So one of the things that I like to do whenever we do any kind of training or education is really to start off with terminology, which I know some of you might feel is a little dry or can be kind of boring. So I'll try to make it lively and interesting with my tone. One of the things I think is important is that we all, in order to be really culturally competent and then to move beyond that to cultural literacy and be able to speak intelligently about a community, is that we all have the same baseline of understanding when we come to identities. And so when we talk about LGBTQ, I'm going to quickly break down, and please feel free to ask questions that we'll get to at the end about anything related to terminology, knowing that there are words that you may have heard frequently, and there are words that you may not have ever heard before, and you might have questions about, or you might even have a specific experience with that might make you, have a difference of opinion here. So when we talk about LGBTQ, the acronym itself is the most commonly used acronym right now. 5-10 years ago, you may have just seen gay and lesbian community, you may have seen LGBT, and then the Q was added probably within the last 4 to 5 years. LGBTQ became the most universally recognized acronym when President Obama used it to address the nation in 2008, and so that was the big shift there. So when we talk about this community, we're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer individuals. And so some of you may have a really good understanding of the words lesbian, gay, and bisexual. And the reason is because lesbian, gay, and bisexual identities are things that we hear about in the news media, in social media, in even just thinking about television shows. You have gay, lesbian, bisexual characters on TV. Everyone knows someone who identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual. And so a lesbian is a woman attracted to other women. A gay man is a man attracted to other men. And a bisexual individual is a person attracted to both men and women. And so we're not going to spend too much time on those, but I will draw your attention on the right here where we have a few what I'm calling guiding words. The guiding words are here to really help you understand why we use the terminology to define these identities that we're using. So when I said lesbian, I did not say a woman who is sexually attracted to other women. I said attracted to. And it's really important that the way that we use the words that we're using is intentional. And so the word attraction is based on more than just a sexual attraction, which is where a lot of negative stereotypes come from when it comes to lesbian, gay, and bisexual individuals. For a long time, we had a lot of stereotypes and discriminatory practice that was based on a focus on sexual activity or sex acts within the LGBT communities. And so when we use the word attraction, it's really to draw to mind the fact that everyone experiences attraction in a different way. And it's not just based on physical or sexual attraction, but romantic attraction, emotional attraction, love, and all of those other parts of attraction. And so when we talk about lesbian, gay, bisexual individuals, we want to make sure we use the word attracted to, not sexually attracted to. So that's just a minor note for what you may already have known about LGBT communities. The term I'm going to spend a little more time on is transgender. This is where some folks may really have a good understanding of trans individuals and transgender people. We are starting to hear much more about transgender issues, transgender rights, and transgender identities in the media. Some of you may know Laverne Cox as one of the most influential trans actresses of our time right now. And so we have representations and examples of transgender individuals. And so what does it mean to be transgender? Transgender is defined by someone whose sex assigned at birth does not match their gender identity. And so when we think about what that means, we have to really consider, okay, on the guiding words, we have sex assigned at birth. What is that? It is literally what it sounds like. Whenever you are born, any baby that is born, it will have its sex assigned at birth by a medical doctor. Whatever that person sees based on external genitalia will automatically get that child a female or a male gender marker put on their birth certificate. That marker will also follow them on their driver's license, will be connected to the social security number here in the United States, etc. And so that has nothing to do with your actual gender identity. If sex assigned at birth is biological and is based on external genitalia observed by a medical practitioner, then what is gender? Gender is an identity. It is what we call ourselves, the way that we see ourselves within our own minds, with our own hearts, how we express our own gender. It is defined by an individual rather than by any kind of anatomy or any kind of biology. Gender is an identity, and every single person has a gender identity that they have chosen for themselves. For some of us, the word cisgender, and that's the last guiding word that you see on the right, CIS gender, is how we might identify. So for example, I myself was sex assigned at birth. My sex is female, and I identify myself, my gender identity, as a woman. I am a cisgender individual. Cisgender is a word that exists to be the exact opposite of the word transgender. So cisgender is a person whose sex assigned at birth does match their gender identity. It is estimated that about 97 to 98% of the population is cisgender. It's important that we use this terminology because otherwise we have this othering effect that happens. About 5 or 6 years ago, we had people who said, well, there's trans people and then there's everyone else. And that was very othering of the transgender community because it almost set this standard of normal people and then trans people. And so we want to get away from that and really want to make sure that we're saying there are cisgender people and then there are transgender people, rather than saying normal versus abnormal or unusual. So that's one I would usually spend more time on if we were in person so people can engage in dialogue, but I think it's important that if you have any questions about what it means to be transgender, that you really do try to engage in doing some research on the topic. It's a really important category when we think about gender and sex and the differential. If this is a new conversation for you, I totally understand, and that's very real for a lot of people that it's a new topic to really consider what are the differences between the word sex and the word gender. Our society has done us a disservice in conflating the two words for a very, very long time and still continues to do so. So please seek out more information if you're interested. The next word we have up here is queer. The word queer is also a term that has been reclaimed by the LGBTQ community, but can feel very difficult for some folks to say. When Bonnie and I did this presentation at the Kansas Planners Conference, there were folks in the room who really struggled because it is a word that is rooted in negativity. It is a word that they grew up knowing as a slur that should not be used. And so we really want to make sure that we hold space and really make sure that we give attention to the fact that generationally, this word may seem inappropriate for you. And if that's true, again, that's okay. We don't force you to use words that you're uncomfortable using. We do want to say that you should have an understanding of what the word means today. So today, the word queer, if you were to Google it or look it up in a dictionary, quite literally means different. Anything that differentiates from the norm, which is why we entitled this presentation Queer and the Conversation. We want to be able to say that we're queering the conversation of planning and how you do that work. And so to be an ethical aspirational planner, you can do that in a queer way, because it's differentiating from the norm and might even differentiate from the things that you learned in planning school. And so queer as an identity can be referring to either somebody's attraction or their gender identity. So all you know about somebody who identifies as queer is that they are either not heterosexual or maybe they are not cisgender. And so being really mindful of somebody who identifies as queer, you should allow them to self-identify that way and only use that identifier for a person who has identified themselves this way. The word queer is also used as an umbrella term to discuss everyone in the LGBTQIA community because all of these folks are either sexual minorities or diverse gender identities. And so when we talk about this, we often hear queer politics or queer topics. In higher education, we talk about queer theory. We even have queer literature. There are universities across the country that actually will confer degrees in queer studies. And so thinking about the way the word has become a universal umbrella term for the LGBTQIA community is also important. The last word we have up here is asexual. Asexual is also referring to sexual orientation, and it means the absence of sexual attraction. So this is somebody who is a person who does not experience sexual attraction. And again, pointing to the guiding words, the word attraction is also important when we talk about asexuality, because it does not mean that people who identify as asexual will not form long-lasting partnerships or relationships. It means that they are not interested in the sexual aspect of a relationship, which does not mean that that precludes them from emotional or romantic connections. We often hear a lot of stereotypes about asexual individuals, that they don't have romantic relationships, or that they are single, or that they are somehow removed from society, and that's just not true. And so we want to really break down those myths. So those are some pretty fast ways of defining these terms, and we want to be cognizant of saying that the terminology we define for you today is textbook definitions, which is different from the experience of that identity. So if you should meet somebody who identifies as bisexual and they should define it for themselves in a different way than I have defined it for you today, that is okay. It is all about their own self-determination of what that means for them. And also to remind you that this is not an exhaustive list. There are way more identities that we could have talked about today, but these are the ones that we hear most frequently, either on our college campus or in general in our society here in Lawrence, Kansas. And so really thinking about what are other terms that you may have heard that you want to ask about, please let us know. Or please look that up. There's so much really rich information that you can do much more research. And so this session is timed, and so we won't get into all of them, but those were a few quick ones for you.
And this really does reveal why, and Vanessa, when you introduced yourself, you said my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And so I think going through this terminology is revealing why you did that.
Absolutely. I think whenever we have a conversation about gender identity and gender expression, we often make assumptions about people based on what we see and how they express themselves. And we want to make sure that we let you all know that assumptions can be very dangerous. And so pronouns are one thing that we assume about people based on their outward expression all the time. I mean, we do this constantly. It is an unconscious bias that every single person has, including myself, including Bonnie. We are working at this. We're all doing our part to get better. And so letting folks know these are my pronouns really opens the door for people who use gender neutral or gender inclusive pronouns to say, well, I use they, them, and theirs. And it's the way that we can automatically start to be more inclusive of our trans community members or anyone who identifies outside of this binary structure in our society that is only male and female or only men and women.
Okay, great. Well, and the next we're going to talk about what do we even know about our communities? This is an excerpt from a news release from the University of Kansas just in October of this year, and it's discussing the results of some research by two political science professors, Don Heider-Markel and Mark Joslin. And in their research, they found that the public tended to consistently overestimate the size of the gay and lesbian population, both back in time in the 1970s and 1977, and closer to today, 2013. Even though the social and political landscape has changed dramatically over those years. So in 2013, for example, the average response on a population estimate was 23%. And in 1977, it was in the range of 10 to 19%. Well, actually, researchers estimate that 3 to 6% of the US population identifies as gay or lesbian, though one estimate suggests as high as 10%. So when we're asking people to estimate the size of minority groups, they tend to drastically overestimate those things. And Don Heider-Markel and Mark Joslin found that the policy ramification of those overestimates is that people tend to think, well, we don't need to pay attention to these groups anymore. They're not minorities. And so we don't need to think about, supporting employment protections or legalizing same-sex marriage or things like that, because these aren't minorities. And so the way that we gather data and information makes a difference, and we can't just rely on our gut reactions to be accurate. So as a result, perhaps, and I might add that in addition to this, we can't rely on the U.S. Census for this kind of information. They don't ask the questions that would help us understand ourselves and our communities better. Maybe we could change the way that we ourselves as planners do surveys.
Absolutely. I think whenever we consider the numbers that we're talking, I get asked very frequently in my work, how many people are we really talking about that are affected by the work with the Center for Sexuality and Gender Diversity, even thinking about the number of students that we impact here on the KU campus or any campus. And it's really important that we recognize that even though there is some research being done, the estimates vary, right? Between 3 and 6% and 10% is actually a very large number in terms of population numbers. And so we don't have Census Bureau data. We don't have a lot of ways that we are conducting this research. And so whenever you all are doing this, now that you are gaining this cultural awareness and cultural competency with the way that what terminology means, what can you do with that? And so you all do surveying, and LGBTQ folks should be included in demographic collection. Anytime that you are working with a community, it's really helpful to know whether or not a large part of the community, or even a significant minority of the community, identifies as LGBTQ, so that they are not forgotten or excluded, which is the default, right? When we don't know, then the default is heteronormativity, and really working toward the majority groups. And so we offer you a suggestion here. Again, you could have way more options, and or your surveying could look differently, but this is a question that we get asked pretty frequently on the KU campus is, if I want to do demographic collection, how do I ask these questions? And so we offer you a suggestion of, if you are collecting sexual orientation data, that you allow people to select from gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, asexual, and always offer a fill-in space or an other. It's really important that we recognize, like I said previously, that this is not an exhaustive list, and so we want to give people the chance to self-identify. And then for gender identity, and I want to make a specific note that this is different from sex demographic collection. And so if you are collecting sex, you should also collect gender, because sex is a legal category. There is no third sex option in the United States, although there are at least 13 countries internationally that do collect a third sex option on their birth certificates. And so for our US purpose, gender identity is not the equivalent of sex. And so if you're only collecting sex demographics, you might only get male or female. Although for sex, you could also include intersex, which is a whole nother topic, I think. So we're not going to go down that road. But gender identity should be the options of man, woman, trans, and we put the little plus sign there to really make sure that we say that trans is inclusive of trans men, trans women. And you should also allow people the option to circle as many as apply, because there might be people who identify as queer and a man, or as trans and a man, right? So that would be trans men or trans women. The automatic default is that when we say men, we mean cisgender men, and that's some of the ways in which our language is really very problematic and has not evolved beyond that. So that's why we encourage you to do the circle all that apply option, if that's possible for your surveying.
Okay, and we're so that's one thing that we as planners can do. The next thing, we're going to talk about an activity that you could do that can help people think about how to be more inclusive, or at least to put themselves into somebody else's shoes for a little while.
And so when we talk about this experiential activity that we encourage you to do with either colleagues or community members, we're giving you a little bit about when to use and when not to use. And so, as always, it's a way to demonstrate cultural literacy of your community. And also to educate folks who might need that education, because we know that there is no formalized way of receiving this education unless you log on to this webcast. But in general, in school, you will not have heard these topics and these identities. When not to use. This is important to spend some time saying that if you are uncomfortable with the content, or you don't feel prepared to answer questions about the content, then don't use it. I think it's really important that we don't do any harm here for any community members who might identify with the LGBTQ community. And so if you're not ready yet, or if you're not prepared fully, please be cautious of that, and really think about how you will respond to resistance from community members, knowing that all different political ideologies may be in the room, and all different levels of experience might be in the room. You have to be prepared for resistance. And that is the work that Bonnie and I have found, even just at the Kansas State Planners Conference, and in our work. You have got to be ready for resistance. And so here's the actual technique.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. This is the technique, and hence the name of this session about queer in the conversation.
And so here's how you might queer the conversation. Here's an example of an activity that we actually did with the Kansas planners. And so the activity is called the impact of silence. And so this is a little bit about what you would actually encourage people to do. You'd encourage them to grab a piece of paper and silently and for themselves write down a few things. So number one, we asked people to write down 3 names of people or relationships that are very important to you. And so you can actually follow along with this and do it for yourself and really consider what you would write down here, and I think you might find it really fruitful to really consider how you would feel once I give you the directions. So you write down 3 people or relationships that are important to you. Then you write down 3 important places that have some sort of special meaning to you. We encourage folks to say physical locations that can be specific or as broad as possible. 3, we ask that you list 3 life events, things that have actually happened in your life, things that you usually share with friends. So life events, graduation, having a baby, getting married, life events. And then the last one is we ask you to write down 2 life events that we want to happen to us for our future. This is goals that you're working toward. Folks usually write down, getting a promotion, getting tenure, retirement, things that you're looking forward to that you're working toward. And so the whole idea with this is that we have people write this down, and then we ask folks in the room to pair up with each other, somebody that they don't know, or even just using your imagination, say this is somebody that you're making a new friend with. And the whole idea behind this activity is that it's supposed to place you in maybe a workplace scenario if you're thinking about it through the lens of where you work and what you do for a living. And so we ask you with your partner and your list, you're going to talk about yourself for 1 minute. And so you will talk for your 1 minute, then we say switch, and then the partner talks about themselves for 1 minute. The only rule is that you cannot talk about anything you wrote down. So all of those things on your list, you cannot talk about them, you cannot mention them. If you, for example, on number 1 wrote down the name of your spouse, you can't then say, oh, my spouse, rather than using their name. That's the same person, and that's cheating, right? So you can't even mention your spouse at this point. And so when we did this here at the Kansas State Planners Conference, it was a really, really fruitful conversation. And people, every single time we did this, there was an audible groan once we told people they couldn't speak about the things they had written down. And so we got a lot of really good feedback on what participants said. Participants said that it was very difficult because these are their go-to topics. These are the things that they usually like to talk about with friends or with people that they meet. We're also people who try to form connections. So for example, if I have children, I want to know, do you have children? If I like hiking, I want to know if you like hiking. And those are kind of the things that we try to make connections with people so that we kind of start to share our commonalities.
Well, and at the conference, I participated in this with a planner that I kind of knew from previous conferences, but didn't know very well. And when Vanessa said to start the 1 minute introduction of yourself to the partner in the exercise, I opened my mouth and then nothing came out. And my brain hurt because I thought, what am I supposed to say? And the person participating with me had the same kind of just visceral reaction of, well, what are we going to talk about? And actually, I have to admit, I overheard some other people, another pair talking, and they were talking about what food they like. and I thought, okay, I can talk about that, and I can recommend some restaurants here in town. But that was the extent of the conversation. It wasn't much.
So because this is about LGBTQ identities, you might already be understanding some of our point here. It's called the impact of silence. And so it's supposed to, in a very small way, emulate what it might be like to be an LGBTQ identified person in a new community, right? When we're thinking about planning or we're thinking about our communities, if you are just moving to a place and you are an LGBTQ person or an LGBTQ couple, would you be open and honest about the people or the relationships that are important to you, or the places that you all like to visit together, or even the life events that you've shared that are really important? And when we think of life events, we think about marriage and children, and we think about those big things that we often talk about. And so is that different if you are an LGBTQ person? And so the debriefing of this activity is very important. So if you do choose to use this activity, here are some debriefing questions that we encourage you to ask. We always start off by asking folks who had a very similar experience to Bonnie's, was this easy or was it difficult? And to really consider why. What was the most difficult thing not to talk about? In our experience, most people say that the difficult thing is to leave out family, and really to consider, well, what if you were an LGBTQIA family and you are meeting a new person in a new environment that you don't know very well? You don't know if it's a friendly environment. What would this feel like? We also ask folks to consider, this was a minute. And you can talk about restaurants, you can talk about the weather, and you can talk about almost anything for 1 minute, right? I can talk about breakfast for at least a minute. That's easy. It was a Pop-Tart. It was wonderful. And so thinking about this, what if you had to do it for an hour, but the same rules applied? And what if you had to do this for 40 hours a week, right? Thinking about your workplace again, would you be able to accomplish this task? And really recognizing that this is the lived experience of LGBTQ folks. I saw a webinar recently that said 53% of LGBTQ people do not come out at work. And that's really important when you consider the fact that what are the things that you know about your coworkers? The things that you wrote down on your list if you're participating along with this activity, do your coworkers already know some of those things about you? On my list, personally, I can tell you that my coworkers could have written that list for me. They could have guessed because we know each other so well. Think about, what if you had to do this, maybe not with a coworker, but with a close friend or a family member? Is this more difficult if you are keeping your true self and your true identity from family members or from close friends, right? This is, again, the lived experience of some LGBTQ folks, depending on your community, depending on their circumstances, etc. And so the last thing is really to consider the things that you wrote down on your list. Would they reveal your sexual orientation or your gender identity? And we will tell you, for many participants, the answer to that question is yes. And so this activity of really considering the silence that we aren't hearing, right, the voices that we aren't hearing, is important when you think about how we can be aspirational planners and really starting to hear these voices and starting to make spaces that LGBTQ folks show up in and know that they can share these things on their list with us. And so just remind participants whenever you do this that this is the daily lived experience of some LGBTQIA folks, and that LGBTQ folks may remain silent because their environment is unknown or is known to be unsafe. And that's an important distinction, right? Some places are unknown, the safety, right? They might be super inclusive, but we don't know that. There are also places that we know are unsafe places to be out. And so really thinking through which of those communities do you live and work in?
Yeah, and that gets us to a next point, which is how do you know you have an inclusive community or not? So here are a couple of things to think about.
So is your community an inclusive environment, and how would you know? Bonnie and I had a conversation about this, even just thinking about here in Lawrence, Kansas, which is said to be the progressive city of the state. And so we really tried to break this down for our own community.
Yeah, and I thought about this, how would I know whether Lawrence was inclusive or not? And so I did a technique that a lot of you would be familiar with, of where you would give a citizen a camera or ask them to go around town and take pictures of whatever it is, the issue that you are wanting to know about, good or bad things in your neighborhood or in your city. So I went out in Lawrence with the mission of photographing things that would seem to let me know that this was an inclusive community. I found a business downtown that had an equal sign on the door. I found this sign actually in my neighborhood on the corner. And then I found this bookstore window in downtown. And in this bookstore window, you have, just some of the titles are Gabriella Clove and Cinnamon, the book, The Age of Innocence. Up in there is the Quran, a book on religion and American culture. There's a children's book that looks like it's about transportation called Pick Me Up. Another book titled Sex Object. And then, of course, a book on pies. So it sounds pretty, fairly inclusive to me. But then we were talking about that it might vary across the community. The two of those photos were from downtown Lawrence. There are different parts of Lawrence in different commercial areas and newer areas. And if I had taken photos there, I might have gotten something very different. So this is another good exercise that you might try is what evidence would you provide to someone that you live in an inclusive community?
And it's so interesting, you know, the HRC sign, the sticker, the equal sign there. This is, you know, we had this conversation, and I promise you I did not plant this seed in my wife's mind. My wife and I live somewhere else in Kansas, in Lenexa, Kansas, and she recently went to a dentist. And they had an HRC sticker in the window. And so she just, I mean, it's a dentist, right? You're not coming out to your dentist maybe, but she automatically felt better about having chosen that dentist. We moved from Lawrence to Lenexa, so it was the first time that she was looking for a doctor. And so it really does make a difference on how you feel welcomed in a space and in a community whenever we don't know very much about it. Like I said, we just moved. And so that really matters when we think about looking for places where we're going to give our money, thinking about the fact that we know in Kansas, and Bonnie alluded to this earlier, sexual orientation and gender identity are not federally protected statuses. So we could be discriminated against in housing, whatever apartment complex that we choose to rent from could legally say, we choose not to rent to you as a lesbian couple. And so that is something that's really important whenever we see symbols that start to welcome us in this space. And so thinking about that, what are the needs of the LGBTQ people in your communities? I really encourage you all to look up whether or not your state is one of those that does protect LGBTQ identities. There are 29 states in this country that do not protect sexual orientation. There are 32 countries in, 32 states in this country that do not protect gender identity, which is a really important distinction, right? So look that up, figure that out. And if you do live in one of those states that does not protect, then there are the city ordinances that might protect. So here in Lawrence, for example, the city of Lawrence does protect sexual orientation and gender identity, although the state of Kansas does not. And so it really does become nuanced, but it's a really important question to have answered. And so then the last question that we want you to think about is really how are the needs of LGBTQ people different from straight and cisgender individuals? Thinking about what restroom facilities exist in community rec spaces or community pools, things like that. How are they different? What are the needs that are not being met? As a straight person, the things that you might not ever have to think about in choosing a place of worship, for example. All of those things really do matter in terms of the way a community is structured to be either inclusive or exclusive of LGBTQI people.
Okay, so we promised you a scenario, so we're going to throw one at you here. So here we go. A gay bookstore is coming to town. They would like to renovate a space in an old warehouse that was last used for offices. It is zoned for offices, but the city's future land use plan shows the area for future walkable retail space. Planners think this is a case where the proposed rezoning to mixed-use office retail meets the plan and are recommending approval. Numerous citizens come to the city council meeting protesting rezoning the property to allow this particular bookstore, saying it is nearby a school and public park. The city council is unsure what to say. They were surprised by the opposition. Planning staff were surprised by the opposition. The mayor looks over to you on the planning staff and asks, "What about these issues raised by citizens here tonight?" What do you say in response? Does the AICP Code of Ethics provide some guidance? Now, I think that if you look strictly from a technical point of view, this is a pretty straightforward thing as to what you would say that just has to do with your knowledge of being a competent planner. And you would say that the rezoning meets the community agreed upon plan. The bookstore is not an adult bookstore, so it wouldn't trigger any distance requirements or anything like that. And that that sort of response fits right in with the parts of the codes of ethics that deals with competency and knowledge of planning and being a professional. If I were to then put on my aspirational hat from the Code of Ethics, I would then be sort of trying to check myself and wonder, well, why was I surprised? Why did this blindside planning staff and city council? Do I not know my community as well as I thought I did? Are we not as inclusive as I thought we were? So kind of going back to that, us planners understanding the context of our community. So I would kind of wonder that. When I brought up this scenario to Vanessa, she pointed out, well, what would you do to make sure that the owners of the gay bookstore and people that would be their customers still felt safe in your community and welcomed? And that's when I thought about the other parts of our Code of Ethics, the aspirational parts, and made me start to think, well, what else would I do at that city council meeting when the mayor turns to me and asks me a question that would go beyond simply the technical legal aspect of that? Sure, this was something that we could approve and it was appropriate with our plans. So I thought about, I mean, it would be easy for me to then add in to my response to the mayor at the city council meeting if our comprehensive plan or maybe our vision statement had something about being inclusive in it. I could also say, not only does this meet our future land use plan, it also meets our vision statement, which is to be an inclusive community. Now, if that language like that wasn't in some officially approved vision statement or plan, could I then, just based on my Code of Ethics, go on to say, myself as a planner, an AICP planner, my Code of Ethics instructs me to help build inclusive communities, and I would want this application to be viewed as something that helps our community be more inclusive. So I was wondering, also, what do you do the day after the meeting? Anything? I think that's then you do look at those aspirational principles and you begin to think about, do I do something that's beyond just technically the correct answer to the mayor's question? What else could I do the next day and beyond? So we put together a list of some things that you might want to think about doing the day after the meeting and beyond.
So I think a lot of what this scenario does too is really draw to mind, sometimes we don't know, right? Sometimes we don't have a clear understanding until something happens, until there is a vocal anti-LGBTQ statements that might be made. And so really what could we do to mitigate these problems in the future? And I think some of that involves collection of demographic information to really have a better understanding of, well, you know, this is something that is necessary in our community. You know, if a gay bookstore is necessary because we have a robust community of LGBTQ folks who live here. I think really thinking about what can you do to try the exercise technique that we've already given you within your office. Try the Queer in the Conversation exercise and help people put themselves into a mind frame of what LGBTQ people experience daily. And so I think also inviting folks who identify as LGBTQ to share their voices and share their lived experience, whether that's in your office, but also in your community. There are LGBTQ people living in every single community across the world. LGBTQ people are everywhere, whether or not we might know that. And I think even in some of our work, we've heard, well, we don't really have LGBTQ people here. I guarantee you that that is false. That is absolutely not true. And so finding those folks and really engaging in them in conversation and saying, you know, what is your experience here? And that's really important to, well, first and foremost, not just tokenize them, but ask if they are comfortable to share those experiences. But if they are, really doing the listening part of being a good aspirational leader, I think would be important. Also creating planning processes that are inclusive open, welcoming, and long-term learning environment, right? We talked about that in the very beginning, and Bonnie pointed out the difference between being inclusive, and I think that that's where it really comes down to the ways in which we build inclusion with the voices at the table of LGBTQ people.
Hey,
I think also.
Sorry, it's Christine.
Yeah.
I'm just going to interject now. When you get a moment, we've had several people ask questions about what constitutes a gay bookstore. So before you get too far off that, could you explain?
Yeah, so when we say what constitutes a gay bookstore, it's a bookstore that has LGBTQIA literature and is usually owned by an LGBTQIA person. And so gay bookstores are kind of a throwback actually to something that we saw a lot in the 70s, 80s, and kind of fell off a little bit more in the early 90s. And they popped up around communities all across the country where there was just meeting spaces and started to be community spaces for LGBTQ folks to just build that community that happened to also be bookstores. There's actually some pretty historic bookstores that still exist that are gay bookstores in San Francisco, Atlanta, big major metropolitan areas. I don't know if that answered the question enough.
Yeah, and we were talking about where that there are now at universities whole lines of studies that's queer literature, and so really just trying to have a scenario where you're being confronted by that we know that this bookstore is one that's going to probably not only carry other books, but is going to be a place that will be welcoming to the LGBTQ community. And are we, as a community, open to that?
So it's a bookstore that focuses on queer literature, I think is really what it would be. And the scenario I think could have been a gay coffee shop or a gay club or a gay bar, right? We used bookstore because it's not saying a bar is next to a school or whatever it might look like, but the idea behind a scenario is that where are queer spaces, where are gay spaces, and that's something that has fallen off a little bit from communities that we used to see in a very robust way. For the need to build community, or it could have even been like an LGBTQ community center, right? Which is something that is absolutely necessary in a lot of spaces, but doesn't exist as much as we would like it to.
And we want to be cognizant that we're ready to get some questions. So I think we will try and wrap this up. So there's a good list of what you can do. You can also remember to share your pronouns when you introduce yourself, or maybe on your email signature, you can add that in there. I want to kind of come back to full circle to where we began and ask, is our code doing enough? Just recently, 49 members of the Kansas chapter of the American Planning Association signed a letter to go to the AICP Commission asking them to revisit the codes of ethics and to raise the bar from just unlawfully discriminate against another person, and to change our code of ethics. So if you agree with our code perhaps being changed, maybe you could also send such a letter or contact your AICP commissioner. Also, that number one item there, that's the International City County Managers Association statement from their code of ethics. So if you're ICMA or know someone who's ICMA, they could do a better job as well. So I want to move to our last slide, which has contact information. And I think, Christine, we are ready for some questions.
Okay, wonderful. I will jump in. And folks, just as a reminder, we have about 20 minutes for questions. Go ahead and type those into the chat box on your webinar toolbar. It should be hanging out on the right side of your screen there. Okay, first question. In survey demographic data, what do you think about asking gender identity with a fill-in blank instead of all the choices?
I think that is good so long as you can provide people an explanation of what it means to say gender identity. As much as I would like that to be true, I don't think that it is a universally recognized term. And so, again, a lot of the time when people see the word gender, this is actually something that only in this academic cycle, 2017, was corrected on our admissions forms at the University of Kansas. We were asking people, what is your gender? When in reality, we were giving them sex categories of male and female. And so if you're going to allow people to enter their gender identity and then just leave a fill-in, I would give folks a description of what is gender identity or what is meant by that. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of, or they have the potential to get a lot of people writing in male or female when they've already clicked that box under sex. And so those suggestions that we give you is because we've been asked to provide suggestions in the past for a lot of research demographic collection here at the University of Kansas. And so I think, yes, absolutely leave a fill-in box so that people can choose their own identities and provide that for you. But it might get a little tricky with some of your responses if we're not giving enough definition.
Okay, thank you. I know we talked about this, but if you could just repeat again, could you give a good explanation of cisgender for understanding and clarification?
Absolutely. So cisgender is somebody whose sex assigned at birth matches their gender identity. And when I say matches, I mean based on our societal expectation. So somebody who was sex assigned female and identifies as a woman is cisgender. Somebody who's sex assigned male and identifies as a man is cisgender. Cisgender is what we consider to be the default. Everyone is assumed to be cisgender, and that's why folks have to come out as transgender.
Okay. I believe it or not, there aren't any more questions. There have been a few that were very long and intricate. So for those folks, if you could just go ahead and reach out to the speakers specifically to get some input.
Well, and Christine, I had another technique to share.
Oh, please do. And if there's more questions that come in, we'll try to squeeze those in. But yeah, feel free. Go ahead.
And so when we were talking about how do you know that your community is inclusive, and I kind of immediately as a planner thought of the go around and take some photos. As Vanessa and I were talking, and we were talking about that different parts of Lawrence would feel different, I was reminded of another technique that we often learn in planning school and that we use for citizen engagement processes, which is to do an imageability map. And so having people map how they experience their neighborhood or how they experience their city using the Kevin Lynch patterns of path, node, landmark, things like that. And I would be interested in people doing that exercise with being inclusive in mind. And you could probably see in how people map their communities where they feel safe and welcome and where they might not, because part of that symbol system for the imageability map is an edge, which can be physical or it can be psychological. And so kind of figuring out those places in our communities where there are psychological edges that people might not feel welcome or safe. And I think that's another technique that we already have in our toolkit as planners that we could adjust to help us understand our communities and how inclusive we are as well.
Okay. So just more questions that are kind of coming in. The presentation will be available after the end of the session. I'll grab a PDF from our speakers and post it on our webpage, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. And I'm just looking through these last questions.
Christine, while you're doing that,
Yeah.
this is Cade. I have sort of a general question, and I apologize to both Bonnie and Vanessa if it comes out of left field, but the scenario made me think very much about our experience as planners versus our imagined experience as planners. Many of us imagine that we're going to spend a lot of time, working with the community, engaged with workshops, and many of us do, and it's active dialogue back and forth. But there are many of these scenarios, at least once a week, maybe more than that we're attending public hearings, and it's very institutionalized, it's very rote, it seems like it's beyond our control, and I'm wondering, aside from the fact that there were questions that came up and that sparked a question of how well do I know my community or what would I say, are there certain things that either of you suspect we could do to sort of improve our sort of common routine processes to be more inclusive, or at least to feel more inclusive, or is that necessary?
Well, I think this is a good question, Cade, because I think particularly when it comes to that day-to-day work of a planner, particularly for, say, a city or a county where you're processing applications, you can kind of get into the routine. And just earlier this year, I also had another article in the Journal of the American Planning Association about how to improve our staff reports. And I think we have to always be thinking of how can we push the routine to be more like our aspirational principles. And so I was thinking just the other day about our staff reports that we write all the time explaining to our planning commission and our city commission about how an application fits with our policies or regulations, that it would be interesting to push that staff report to also include an evaluation of how this helps us be a more inclusive community. I think that would put more of our aspirations into what we do day to day. And I think we have to keep our eye on that, or it will become just routine. And so we might think about our public hearings. What can we do to make sure that people are comfortable walking up to that podium and saying what's on their mind? What can we do to make it to where people are more comfortable expressing themselves in that sort of long-term ongoing learning community, so that it isn't just the public hearing where someone can stand up and talk at the microphone, that they can feel like they're heard all along and not just at that public hearing.
Thank you. I like that idea, because I think there's something in between a sticker on the door and a full-blown workshop that allows people to feel that just as part of our day-to-day routines in civil activities that people can speak. I'm also wondering if there might be, as the planner, you think about maintaining your plans and some clause that you put in there that it's going to be reviewed every 5 years or every year. If you're aware of any, either there at the university, I mean, you have Vanessa working on it every day, but is there some sort of like annual point at which you can collect all your ideas you've assembled in the file and go through and see how you might update or fix things?
Well, and of course, we are supposed to every year be looking at and evaluating our plans and seeing how well we're doing. That evaluation part often gets forgotten about. And so I do think that this is just another kind of adding inclusivity to the list of things that we're supposed to be doing as planners, and checking in on that every now and then is good. And we are pretty familiar with, it's become pretty common to have the principles of sustainability, whether we call it sustainability or not, in what we do as planners, and looking out for economy, ecology, and equity. And I think we know that a lot of times we fall short on the equity part. And so adding inclusion into there and paying attention to that is a way of getting at that third E, equity, that we often struggle with and that often gets forgotten.
So if I could ask one more question then before Christine comes back with more. I'm wondering, Bonnie, as a professor, what might you suggest could be some new requirements? AICP determines which programs are accredited. What might be some ways of thinking or making sure that certain topics are taught? Because as we learned, it's not just simple facts or points of information, but this sort of ongoing, evolving dialogue that everybody is going to be at a different place in learning or at a different place in experience. What would be a way to teach that, or how does one incorporate that into a program so that it's part of what a master's student graduates with?
Oh, very good question, Cade. And actually, paying more attention to diversity and inclusion are parts that the Planning Accreditation Board is having those of us who are at accredited planning programs pay attention to. And here at our planning department at the University of Kansas, we have started teaching our students mindfulness and how to be a compassionate planner. And we're teaching students how to techniques to help their planning commission be more mindful. And so we are trying to train the future city planners to have the skills and the mindset to be more inclusive and to kind of try to help foster these inclusive communities. I think a lot of universities are doing that. I think I'm very hopeful for our new planners that are heading out the door, that they're going to have some skills and techniques that I wasn't taught when I came out of planning school. And so that's very hopeful there. But as we all know that in planning, we don't do a good job of attracting members of minority communities to become planners, so we have a long way to go there. But I do think that we are paying attention to that as we educate our young planners.
How about one more question? And this might be more of a Vanessa question, or both of you. And that is, we talk about, and I am familiar with Lawrence, of course, and I can imagine what it feels like to be there. But many of us, just like Vanessa moved, and Lenexa is not that far, but we move to a community, and what if we just move in and we think, wow, it's not welcome? What do we do? It's not welcome.
Well,
sorry.
I will say, I think, I moved to Lawrence 3 years ago, and I had no idea what I was getting into because I moved to Kansas from Colorado, and I think there's a lot of stereotypes about what it means to live in Kansas. I think a lot of what we know about a place before we arrive or when we arrive to a new place is based on political ideologies that we know are here. Are we in a blue state or a red state or a purple state, and what is this county and how did they vote, and who's in charge, right? Who's in city council, things like that. And so I think we start to formulate ideas about a place before we get there, and then we either see things that reinforce what we already know or that totally negate what we thought we knew. And so I think if you arrive into a new place that does not seem like it's an inclusive environment, I would really consider what it is, why that is, right? So is it that there are not friendly establishments in your community? or is that there are no social groups that you can join? Is there not a chapter of PFLAG, for example? For those who don't know, PFLAG is Parents, Friends, and Family of Lesbian and Gays. It's a national organization that has chapters all across the country. The Lawrence and Topeka chapter, for example, are combined together, even though Topeka is about 40, 50 minutes from Lawrence. And so those things, I think, are things to look for, and really to consider that no place is altogether inclusive or uninclusive. No place is altogether safe or unsafe. There are pockets of community that can be found, and so I encourage you to look for those, whether that's online communities that are formed through social networks and then have meetup groups, and or to find the areas of the community that are more inclusive. Something that Bonnie already referred to is even just thinking about the city of Lawrence. There are sections even within this small city. I mean, Lawrence is not huge, y'all. Like it's pretty small, but it is a city. And so thinking about West Lawrence versus East Lawrence is very different. And I think knowing that once you are immersed in a community, you start to find those places and those spaces. And I think, I already mentioned there is no place where there's like, you're going to be the only queer identified person, or you're going to be the only Black individual, you're going to be the only Latino person living in those communities. And I think finding those spaces, whether it's, I recently in Lenexa found a Hispanic grocery store, right, that has all the different spices and things that I grew up with. And so finding those things are really things that start to speak to the area of a place that you want to live in, and then the area of the city that you want to be in. So I don't know, Keith, this is necessarily answering your question, but I think finding community is essential to the survival of minoritized and marginalized individuals, anything that makes them feel like they're not alone. And so I think that can be found in almost any community. And so I encourage you, if that's your situation, to look for that.
I also like the part of your response that examine why you think that, because the truth may be that you're at some place that just has no stickers, doesn't have a lot of people, but it might not be unwelcoming. It just,
Right, exactly. That's what when I first started talking to Vanessa about doing this session, she was first like, well, what's a planner?
I know so much about planning now.
Yeah, we've trained her up. But it is this, just being able to talk with people and to exchange this information and to be curious and to be critical and to be able to do these things. And I kind of want to leave on coming back to our AICP Code of Ethics, which when I have new students come in their first semester, I have them read the code, and they kind of come out of it excited, but also a little scared, because we have some high aspirations. We have big expectations for us. We as a profession are talking about inclusive communities. Who does that? We do. And that's the cool part about planning and being a planner, is that we may not always reach the stars, but we are always striving to do better and to create better communities. And that is reflected in our Code of Ethics. And it is a really cool thing that we do, but it also is asking a lot of us.
Okay, so we had more questions come in, but it is 2:30, so we need to wrap up. So for those folks that have any of those burning questions, feel free to reach out to the panelists specifically, and they can respond back. Thanks so much to all three of you, and for the division for hosting this important session. And it was so well thought out. This, I think, was one of my favorite webcasts so far this year, which, hey, it's December, so nice job, everybody. And, it's a very delicate topic, and it was just very well executed and was not uncomfortable in any way. And I really just want to thank all of you for doing this. And for those that joined in on the session who were either just curious or wanted more info or just needed your ethics credits, I hope that everyone has learned something and that feels more comfortable about this topic. So thanks to everyone. And we will see you all next time. Everyone have a great weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.